Hello everybody, and thank you for visiting Epic Fox Tabletop today. We are going to be doing a How to Play series on Blucher by Sam Mustafa. This is a Napoleonic war game. As most of you know, if you're visiting this specific video, maybe you're just randomly browsing, but chances are you know exactly what you came to see. And we are going to be doing, like I said, a small core versus core game, just to show you the basic mechanics of it. Also, I want to highlight basically my own solo activation system for momentum points and show you how that works. But Blucher is a tabletop game about great battles of the Napoleonic Wars. You may use it to recreate famous historical battles or to create your own fictitious ones. The game may be played with miniature soldiers of any size, or it may be played with unit cards, which are poker-sized cards that represent units and which can play on any flat surface. Now, I've played about 4 games, actually exactly 4 games, using the cards of various scenario sizes. I've played on what you see here is a 6-foot by 5-foot table, all the way up to a 12-foot by 5-foot table, a very large action that we played, and it played fairly quickly, and we finished that game to a conclusion in about 5 hours, I believe it was, and it was a huge game, trust me. But anyway, there is a basic game and there is an advanced game in this, and we will be working our way. I'm not sure how many video series this is going to take up, so we're just going to go with the flow and do it video by video, and whenever I feel that the video has reached a long enough length, then I will go ahead and post it up and start recording the next part of it. However, like I said, we are going to work our way through the basic rules, the activations and momentum, through movement, combat, skirmishing, artillery shooting. We'll take a look at fatigue, retiring units, reserve movement. I might be throwing all this stuff out at you, and it may sound complicated, but it's really not. It's one of the easiest Napoleonic games I've ever read or played, and I think that it's definitely worth taking a look at. I don't think a lot of people have really gone in depth to show the mechanics of it and kind of introduce people to the ease of the system. So that's what we're going to be doing. And what we are going to use to do this is, you can see up in the upper right here, you can see the French, and I can probably zoom that camera, pan that camera a little bit, and you can see the French up top there. And they are at the base of the hill. You may not be able to see the elevation gain, but if you take a close look behind the main line of infantry units, there's 4 brigades of infantry. Behind them on the hilltop, you can see up on top of the hilltop, there is a lot of guns up there, a lot of French guns. It is a full battery, a full unit of guns. Actually, I think it's 3 batteries. You put them together and it equals a artillery unit. So that's what we have up there. You can also detach those to infantry brigades, and basically they are attached artillery, which will help them when they're shooting, but we'll get into that stuff later. Right now I'm just introducing the forces. So the French, they have 4 infantry brigades. Let me see if I can zoom in way up there. That's kind of choppy, actually. I might just zoom back out and go ahead and take it over there. So you can see here we have 4 infantry brigades, the artillery unit up on top of the hill, and then we have a single unit, a single battalion of chasseurs de cheval, French light cavalry. So you can see the way they are based. I kind of based them up into 4 squadrons for the light cavalry, and that is an easy way of identifying light cavalry from heavy cav for my basing method without getting close to the system. Now, I know my brigades very well. I know exactly what is what and who's who when I'm looking at them. However, when somebody is watching it on video or whatever, you may not be able to identify it as quickly. So if you see a cavalry unit with 4 squadrons spread out on the base, you can instantly tell that that is a light cavalry unit. Now keep that in mind when I show you the Russian forces, which, speaking of the Russian forces, we can go ahead and take a look at the Russian forces. Now, right here we have the Russian forces, and we have 6 infantry battalions, or excuse me, 6 infantry brigades, and 1 brigade of Russian cuirassiers. And you can see the heavy cav, already you can see the difference. They are based differently. They are based in 2 lines on the stand. And that is one way of easily identifying the difference between a heavy cavalry unit and a light cavalry unit when you are going to be watching my future battle report videos. You can also tell a difference between the way the infantry for the Russians are based and the way the infantry for the French are based. The French are based in attack column, and the Russians are based in line formations, each of their individual battalions on the stands. And they all have skirmishers out in front of their lines as well. But you may be doing the math here and you have decided, hey, I think my math adds up, and the Russians outnumber the French by quite a bit, actually, and that is true. And that is because throughout this game, excuse me, we are going to be, the French are waiting on some reserves to come in, off-board reserves, to join them and help them win the day. And when they do come on, they will be concealed units and will be able to activate as such and use reserve movement, and we will get to see what happens as that goes on. So now that we know the forces and what is going on, we can take a look at some of the terrain. And the terrain is, you know, pretty minimal at this point. I wanted to keep it kind of simple. So we have a road going almost straight down the middle of the battlefield from table edge to table edge. We have 2 patches of what can be considered a rough type of ground here, but it's more for just looks at this point. And we have 1 hill right here in the lower left side of the table, and opposing that we have a much larger hill where the French artillery is located, and we have a couple woods here down in between the 2 hills. Like I said, I wanted to keep it very sparse on the terrain, just enough to give you examples and show you how some of it works in terms of concealment or movement, and we will look into that in further detail here shortly. However, that is it, and now we will go ahead and take a look at the first subject. Okay, so now we have the unit cards and the unit statistics. Now some people, like I had mentioned previously, play with the cards, or they like to label their bases on the back of them. So when you have a base laying down, it would have the stats written right below it. In my case, I don't do that. I either A, keep a roster, or B, I know what units have what, and I just simply mark hits to their elan as time goes by. But in this case, I'm going to include the unit cards so we can see exactly what's going on, also so you can see them. So up top, when the blank box is normally where you would write in what brigade it is and who's in command of that brigade. Down in the lower left, you would have what corps that unit belongs to. In this instance, all of these purple French units belong to the 1st Corps, and all of these green Russian units belong to the Russian 1st Corps. I'm also going to include a leader in this scenario so we can see exactly how leaders work, how you can attach them to units, and some of the benefits that they can give to your soldiers. So I am going to include Lanz in this battle. Since he is master of defense, we will go ahead, not really master of defense, but he's capable of handling himself. I figured it'd be fun to include him in this scenario. So once again, back down to the unit cards themselves. In the upper right hand corner, the 2 white numbers right above the unit picture, you will see the unit movement value. Now it's in movement unit distance. So the movement value in what I play is 3 inches, and that's 3 inches for these cards as well, meaning each movement distance is 3 inches. So if it's a 2, like the infantry, it means he can move 2 regular movement distances across regular terrain, so a total of 6 inches. The one to the right of it is through rough terrain, such as woods, etc. Now, the numbers in the boxes down below on the bottom of a card are the unit elan. Now, you will see here the light cav has a maximum of 6, and that's what he's going to start off with. Now, that means A, he can take 6 hits before they withdraw or they're destroyed, whatever you want to call it. And B, that's how many die they will roll when attacking or defending, with some exceptions there, depending on what exactly is going on and what modifiers there may be. So as they take hits, that number is going to go down from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 and to 1 until they are eliminated. And that is pretty much the unit cards, with the exception of the point cost. You can see here the light cav costs 10 points. The infantry, the line infantry, costs 12 points, as opposed to the cuirassiers of the Russians cost 15, and the line infantry of the Russians cost 11. You also have some special icons located on the cards. Like here is a silhouette of a skirmisher, and that means they have the skirmishing ability. They get a bonus when skirmishing. There is a shield on the Russian infantry, and that means they are determined, I believe it is. It's steady, and the unit has an advantage on the defense in general due to its discipline, basically. And so the Russians are very heavy on the defense side. They're more than capable of holding down a position. Down below we have artillery, and you can see it looks a little different just from the picture on there. And just says foot artillery on there. You can has room to write in whatever corps they're attached to, and then you have the ammo markers right there. And it works pretty much the same way with those numbers. The first time you shoot, it's going to be, you're going to roll 5 dice to attack. Next time 4, next time 4, next time 3, and then 2 and 2, and then they're out of ammunition. There are ways to refill ammunition, but for the most part, you want to, conserve your artillery for when you think the moment is right to actually use it. You don't want to just, blast away and run out of ammunition and not have anything to support your assaults or your defense if, in desperate times. So the one last thing I should mention on unit cards is the firing arc right here. You can see it marked off by the yellow triangles, and that sort of lets you know what is in their frontal arc is by measuring on those yellow triangles. I'm pretty capable of measuring out those angles without needing my bases specifically marked for that, as are many other wargamers who are quite used to measuring 45, 90, 60 degrees, whatever, whatever angles. We are pretty adept at geometry at this point, I think, if you've been wargaming for any certain period of time. But that is how the unit cards work. One last thing to mention, I know I said this before, is on the reverse side, you can start with units like this who are out of sight, and that means that they are, number one, concealed from the enemy. They can't tell what units are what, and B, it also lets you remember that they are in reserve status and that they can make a single reserve movement. But once they do make a reserve movement, whether or not they've been spotted by an enemy or not, you do flip them back over to their revealed side. And that is the unit cards for Blucher. Okay, now leaders and sub-commanders, as you will call them. So, for the most part in Blucher, the unit commanders and sub-commanders, corps commanders, army commanders, whatever, they're pretty much invisible. At this scale and level of a game, we just assume that they are riding around, doing their job, ADCs riding back and forth, relaying orders, etc. So, there are times, though, however, when a player can use a sub-commander if he has purchased it in his army list, or if you're playing a specific scenario which includes a leader in it, can affect what's going on, come onto the table, and attach to one of your brigades. Now, normally, in the beginning of a scenario, all commanders will start off the table. Now, right here, we can see Little Lon sitting right there next to his unit of artillery. And they can only attach to brigades or units of their specific corps. So I know earlier I said we'll just call it First Corps, French First Corps. I know Lan's Fifth Corps, so we'll just call this Fifth Corps. So we have Lan's sitting up here on top of the table. Now, like I said, normally he would start off the table in the beginning of the game. Me and my friends, we like to put them on the board, so, you know, it makes it look cool. We got little miniature marshals and such running back and forth until they are attached. Now, at the beginning of an activation, you can attach them to a specific unit. So let's just say we attach them to this brigade down here, and then that brigade will then receive any benefits that sub commander can bestow upon it. After that, from turn to turn, let's say if you wanted to move this before the activation, once again, they can move up to 4 distance units as basically a free move, as long as it's not crossing impassable terrain like an impassable river or something like that. But they can simply attach to another unit within that 4 base distance, 4 movement distance range, and that's how they work. Now, certain leaders are more at risk than others, and that is displayed on this card right here. As you can see, Lan's is at risk. I believe he died, was it Aspirin Essling, or... yeah, I think so. Don't beat me up if it wasn't Aspirin Essling. I think it was. Anyway. Yeah, so, and that will affect him if he is in combat. He's more at risk to get hurt, wounded, killed than other leaders. Maybe he's more up front, hands-on type of leader, whatever it may be. Others, you know, they may not be at risk. They kind of float around the back. They provide other type of benefits, whatever. Lan, he bestows a +1 universal modifier in combat to the attached unit. So this is a universal modifier. It's for skirmishing, for shooting, for volley fire is what they call it, or melee. Defense, offense, whatever it may be. It's +1 universal modifier, which is a very good bonus to have. So that pretty much concludes a basic introduction of leaders. And now we will go ahead and go on to the next. Okay, before we actually start rolling some dice and scooting brigades around this table, I want to go over army morale. And before the game, each player must count the total number of infantry and cavalry units in his army. 1/3 of that total number, rounding up any fraction, is his army morale. For example, if an army begins with 19 infantry and cavalry units on the table, its morale is 7. Note that artillery units do not count towards your army morale. However, they do count against it when they break. So, using that formula, we can see down below the French have 4 brigades of infantry and 1 brigade of cavalry. That's a total of 5 units. It is rounding up, so we will have an army morale of 2 for the French. The Russians have 6 infantry brigades and 1 cavalry brigade. That's a total of 7, and that would be a total army morale of 3. So they have 1 greater army morale than we do, or the French. Let's take a look at those good-looking Russians down there. Now, continuing on with army morale, in the status phase of each turn of a player's turn, the active player counts all the units from his army that have broken, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. He does not count the units that have retired, which is leaving the table voluntarily, if the number of broken units has reached or exceeds the army's morale. Then the army's morale has collapsed and he has lost the game. Note, once again, that artillery units do not count towards your army morale. However, they do count against it when they break. Okay, and now we will start to get into the exciting parts of Blucher, and that is the game turn and basics of play. Now, one thing is the game clock. Now, the clock can be anywhere from, 1 turn, which wouldn't make any sense, all the way up to 30 turns. And this counts for a whole entire, basically 24 hours from dawn to dusk, pretty much. And one player, does not matter which, will keep track of the game clock on the table. The clock is in a section of play aid with 2 rows of numbered boxes. A marker is needed, a coin or a poker chip, whatever, to indicate the current turn. The turns do not represent precise amounts of time, but they correspond roughly to periods of the day, as shown in the chart on the player's aid if you have one. Terms like morning or afternoon are used to help scenario designers decide when to begin a battle. When the last turn ends, turn 30, nightfall has occurred. So like I said, it's basically from sunrise to sunup. And there are, other situations in there, but we won't cover them yet. We'll talk about it in the advanced rules. So now that we've gotten the time format down and the turns, we can go ahead and get into the actual sequence of play here. So in a game turn, you have 5 phases, pretty much. You have the first phase, which is the information phase, and you will discover enemy units. You'll check to see if concealed units are within range of your own, and that way you can basically identify hidden enemy units and see them, and this will, give your attack power full strength when you're attacking. You can attack concealed units with artillery and such, but it will be at a reduced effectiveness. The second phase of the game is the movement phase, where you will activate units and move them. You'll adjust current MO until phase ends. And your third phase is the fire phase. Units that did not move may fire. Once again, units that did not move may fire. The fourth phase is the combat phase, where you resolve all combats, close combats, assaults, etc. And your fifth and last phase is the status phase, where you check for reinforcements, which is an advanced game, and we will be reviewing that in this scenario. You'll check army morale, like I covered in previously, and you'll roll MO dice for the enemy's turn. Now, also in this game, speaking of the turn clock, like I was speaking of just a moment ago, each turn is a single player. It's not, both players do not get a turn in turn 1. It's French are turn 1, Russians are turn 2, French are turn 3, Russians are turn 4, French are turn 5, on and on and on. In this scenario, although the Russians will be getting turn 1, so the French will go on turn 2. And that takes care of the movement phase, or excuse me, the turn sequence. Now, concealed, revealed, and discovered units. At the start of the game, most, in some cases, all units are concealed. Their unit cards are face down, showing only their national flags. During the game, concealed units may do things that result in them being revealed, which means that their cards must be flipped over to display all information. Once revealed, a unit may never again be concealed. A concealed active unit must be revealed in either 2 cases: whenever it is activated in its movement phase, or whenever it shoots in its fire phase. And it can be discovered by the active player. Enemy concealed units can be discovered by the active player. If the active player fires upon and hits a concealed unit, that unit must be revealed. If he fires upon but it does not hit, then the unit remains concealed. Or if the active player discovers that unit discovers that unit during his information phase, which is the first phase of the game. In that information phase, we are going to go over right now. Okay, so looking at this, the first phase, like we already reviewed, is the information phase. And in the information phase, the active player determines whether any of his units may discover any concealed enemy units. Now, it is not necessary, a concealed passive unit is discovered if it is within 4 base widths of any active units and is visible to at least 1 active unit. So right now, pretty much there has been no activated units, so everybody is concealed. Instead of using cards When I'm soloing, I simply mark concealed or reserved units with little gemstones, and that reminds me that they are concealed and or reserved and able to make reserve moves, and also the enemy can't see them, obviously. So I use those gemstones instead of the cards, and it just makes it easier as a solo player to remember exactly what's going on and everything else. So now, within 4 base widths of an active unit, so if this infantry unit somehow managed to move all the way across the field of battle over here to within 4 base widths, right here, he's active. He's been activated, so his gem is gone. His card has been flipped over to its normal side. Then he is within distance to reveal any enemy units that's within four movement distances. However, the thing is obviously since we moved, the information phase has already passed. So those enemy units won't be revealed until the following information phase for the French player. So it has to be active units that have moved previously, they're active, and on the current turn in the information phase, they're already within range. So you can't move and then reveal an enemy unit. It doesn't work that way. So here we have the Russians, and it is going to be turn number 1. Now normally, in a 2-player game, what you would normally do is whoever has the first turn, in this case the Russians, the very first thing to do in the game would be that the French player would have to roll in secret momentum dice, and that can be done by taking the momentum dice and rolling them and covering them with a cup or whatever, as long as the active player cannot see how much momentum he actually has, otherwise known as MO. So in a standard game where you have a full, army on the table for each side, there is 3 MO dice that will be rolled. So the inactive player would take 3 die, roll them in secret, and in this case, he would have rolled an 8. So the Russian player unknowingly would have 8 momentum. So he could do a core activation. Let's say he had more than this single core down here on a table at this time. And his first decision is, well, I'm going to move this core. This entire core, I'm just going to move them straight forward, its maximum move distance to advance on the French position. So that's a total of 7 units. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 infantry brigades, and you have 1 brigade of Russian cavalry. So they all move forward their maximum movement distance, and that is a total of 7 momentum. And then he says, the Russian player looks at the French player and says, "May I continue?" And the French player, who has these dice in secret, looks down and sees that there is indeed 8, which means he has 1 point left. And all he says, he doesn't tell him, "Oh, you have 1 point left, you can keep going." All he says is, "Yes, you may keep going." So the Russian player now has a whole nother core. Let's say he has 2 core of the exact same composition, one on the other side of the table. Well, now he takes the second core and he issues the same order. He moves them straight forward towards the French, and that's it. That's that core activation. So he adds up another 7 on top of his 7 momentum previously used, and he has now used a total of 14 momentum. Now he looks at the French player and says, "May I continue?" Let's say he has a 3rd core he wants to activate. "May I continue?" The French player says no, and shows him dice and says, "You only had 8 momentum, you're done." So the Russian player actually got away with a lot more extra momentum because, it just happened to work out that way. So as long as you are under that momentum dice, you can do a full core activation with, 7 brigades, 8 brigades, however many brigades you have in that single core, until you go back and you recount and take a second look at the momentum dice. Now, let's say in another scenario, that the French player secretly rolled an 8. We'll keep it simple. We'll keep that an 8. And the Russian player has 2 core. He moves this full core forward, the same as the first time, 7 momentum. And he asks the player, may I continue? The French player says, yes, you may continue. Okay, so there is another type of activation, which is a single brigade, single unit activation. Well, let's just say this is the second core that he hasn't moved yet. And he wants to keep it in reserve, except for he thinks it'd be a good idea to bring this cavalry over to the core that was just moved and support it. Give it a little bit of extra cavalry support. So he wants to just activate this single unit. So he takes off the concealed die and he moves this unit, however far it can move, off and away to support the other core. Well, that single unit activation, it costs 2 momentum. So now he looks at the player and he wants to do another single unit activation and take one of these infantry off to approach into skirmish range, or fight a delaying action, or whatever it may be. And the French player says, nope, your turn's over, you can't do it. You had 8 momentum rolled, and you used 9 momentum. You used 7 on your first core activation, and you used 2 on your single unit activation. So his movement would be over, and then it would go on into the shooting phase, etc., until the turn was over. One thing to keep in mind about single unit activation and core activations is you can do all the core activations you want as long as you have the momentum for them, but as soon as you do your first single unit activation, you can no longer do any core activations, and that's how that works in a regular 2-player or multiplayer game of Blucher. However, in my solo mechanism, and in this game what we will be doing, because there's only 1 core per side and there's a very limited number of units here, we are not going to be using 3 momentum dice. We are going to be using a single momentum dice. And how that works when I'm playing solo, this is how I do it. Let's say I have 2 core, the exact same size, just the same as in the last example I was giving you. I have 2 core, each of them have 7 units. Okay? So I want to go ahead, in that case, if I had 2 core of 7 units with 14 units total, I would probably be using 2 or even the normal 3 dice is what I would be using. So with 14 units, what I would do is I would issue my orders. Let's say I want to do my first core activation with these 7 units. So I activate them all and I move them. That's 7 momentum points. Now I would roll my momentum dice, and you can see I rolled an 8. So I would say that the Russians can still activate. At that point, if I wanted to activate my whole second core, I already know I can activate the whole thing and it's all good because that's going to be all my units in the army. But let's just say I wanted to activate a single unit out of the second core. So let's say this is my second core I have available, and my first 7 units have already all moved. This is now my second core, and I want to do a single unit activation. So I move this cavalry off, same thing, same scenario. I move it off to the first core that already moved to support it. So now I know I used 7 points of momentum on my first core activation, and now I used 2 more on my single unit activation for a total of 9 points. So I simply re-roll the momentum die, and in that case I got a 14. 14 is still over the 9 total that I've gone, so I'm able to continue on moving. But at this point I cannot use any more core activations because I just used a single unit activation, so now I have to continue moving single units. So let's just say I now order this infantry unit off to advance and start to advance on the French position. So now I know I've used the 7 from the first core activation, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 momentum, and I roll my 3 dice again. And this player is getting very lucky and rolled well above that. Roll a 15. So I can now do another single unit activation. Let's just say I move this guy up and forward. Okay, so now I know 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 MO points. And I just rolled a 10, which is less than the momentum I've used, so now the Russian movement is over. He's done, and now it continues on to the shooting, combat phase, etc. And that is how I do momentum as a solo player. It seems to work really well. You just have to, be aware and be mindful of how much momentum you have already used each turn. And that will help you out tremendously if you mark it down one way or another, or if you have a good memory. That's fine, that works just as well. And it may have seemed like I got a lot of movements out of that, but I did have 4 brigades left hanging. In the beginning, of course, I could have activated both of my corps. I just happened to roll 3 really high rolls for the momentum. I'm not always lucky like that when rolling my momentum. Sometimes half my army is left hanging even when I'm just doing core activations. So I think that system works well for a solo player. There are other people who use cards whenever a face value card comes up, whatever, that's the end of the turn. There are other ways to do it. This just seems to work very well for me and how I play the game. And that is going to conclude the discovery phase, the intelligence phase, as well as rolling for momentum. And here I am going to split this video up because I think I'm probably pushing about an hour at this point, and we will do a part 2, which includes all the fun stuff coming up.